So this week we're going to be looking at how organisms interact with each other. And so it's kind of a fun topic. Um, so we're going to look at a little bit at populations and balance. So some important reminders about metabolism. Metabolism is important because organisms are all needing to obtain energy in order to survive. And the environment can affect how well they can do that. So everything needs some kind of nutrients in order to survive. So it's not just necessarily food. For some organisms, that could be inorganic materials too. So some nutrients are more critical than others. And so, for example, you could go probably 4 or 5 days without eating food and still survive or at least be able to function kind of. But you could not go for more than 3 or 4 minutes without, say, oxygen. So some nutrients obviously are more important than others. Um, and within ecology, we look at how nutrients affect the populations of organisms. So, do they have a big impact on how organisms can survive and reproduce, or do they have a small impact? And the ones that have a really big impact we call limiting nutrients. So these are nutrients that will basically have a big effect on whether or not an organism's or a population is able to sustain itself. So we talked about oxygen. Let's talk about oxygen some more. Not everything requires oxygen. So there are anaerobic organisms, so that might be bacteria, archaea, some types of fungi, but mostly bacteria and archaea. And these guys can thrive without oxygen. And for some of them, oxygen is actually toxic to them. So aerobic organisms are organisms that require oxygen to survive, so that's us. So an important thing here is that too many nutrients are not necessarily a good thing. So you can have too many. Um, for example, we see a big problem here in our country in particular. We have a lot of agriculture, a lot of farming going on. And what can happen is a lot of nutrients used to grow plants, fertilizers, and things that are put into the soil to help plants grow, they get washed into the water. So they get washed into rivers and lakes nearby, and eventually that all piles up somewhere. A big example of this is the Mississippi River. So that runs into the Gulf of Mexico, and it basically brings all of the nitrates and phosphates from the entire Midwest, so the entire farming region of the United States, and it dumps it into one very concentrated spot in the Gulf of Mexico. And so, you think, well, nutrients aren't all bad. That's just like taking too many vitamins. How bad can that be for the marine environment? But it can actually cause a big problem, and this problem is called eutrophication. So eutrophication happens when you have a lot of nutrients dumped into the water, and then you have the phytoplankton who thrive on those nutrients. They just love it. They explode in population. They're just like, wow, eating up all these nutrients that are suddenly being introduced. And that can cause an algal bloom. And maybe you live somewhere where algal blooms happen. Red tide would be an example. Maybe you don't. But basically, when you have an algal bloom, you have then an excessive amount of plankton that are dying because, they live, they die, life cycle. But when you have all those plankton suddenly dying, then you have bacteria decomposing them, breaking them down. Well, decomposition is a process that depletes the water of oxygen. So decomposition takes oxygen out of the environment and uses it. So now we have the oxygen in the water becoming less and less, and so the water is harder for organisms that need oxygen to live in. And so aerobic organisms that need oxygen start to die off, and then bacteria decompose them, and then the cycle continues. So we have a vicious cycle that continues. And eventually, unfortunately, what you can have is something called a dead zone. So if this continues, if this eutrophication just runs away, then you can have an area that has that's completely dead, that's devoid of a lot of aerobic life because of the excessive amount of nutrients. And unfortunately, the Mississippi River Delta is considered a dead zone. And so this is the area around Louisiana and Mississippi where fishermen have noticed that they are not catching nearly as many fish simply because there aren't very many fish because the eutrophication has been happening for so long. So now sometimes these algal blooms can be kind of normal and can even happen seasonally. So for example, here's a normal lake. This would be somewhere up, I think in Canada, in the Canadian Rockies. And during some times of the year, so like say in the summer when it's warmer, they might that temperature might allow for some algae to really take off and grow. And so then during a eutrophication season, the algae, as you can see, are covering the lake. That's the same lake. So it can really make a big difference. And then it kind of goes away. So sometimes eutrophication can be a little bit of a normal cycle. But what we tend to see with nutrient runoff in rivers is that it just kind of gets worse and worse. So the bottom line here is that there's a balance. There's a big ecological balance in living things, and the balance can be very tenuous, can be very delicate. So if you have an excessive amount of any single thing, whether it's a living thing or a non-living thing, biotic or abiotic, that can throw the ecosystem out of balance pretty drastically. So that having been said, let's look now at populations of organisms. So we know that all these organisms need to consume nutrients and resources. We know that too many resources, too many nutrients are not necessarily a good thing. So when we talk about a population, we mean a group made up of the same species that occupies a specific area in a specific time. So population of humans, we could say, there's a population of humans that lives in North America. There's a population of humans that lives in Southeast Asia. So we're talking about one species in a specific area. Populations interact with each other, they interbreed, they have the same environment and needs. And so scientists, if they want to study populations of, say, marine organisms, they have to try to study a geographical range. They have to know basically where that organism lives, where that population lives. So here's an example. Scientists that study the giant clam, this is the geographical range of that giant clam, as you can see in the South China Sea and the South Pacific Ocean. So that would be an example of a geographical range. So where does it live? Now, this can be a tricky thing to figure out, as you might imagine. You can't just go out and count every single organism because that would just be crazy. So one way to do it would be to kind of establish the geographical range first. So figure out, where are the limits of where an organism can live. If we go back to the clam, how far north do we see them before we stop seeing them? How far south, how far east, how far west? It'll give you a rough idea. So if you can establish that geographical range first, and then maybe take a sample size, so maybe count like 1 square mile, a little tiny part of that, and then you can multiply that number and apply it to the whole range to get an approximation of the population. Another method of doing this, or of counting organisms, is the mark and recapture method. So you might see where you live, you might have seen animals that are tagged or have some kind of marker on them. And basically, scientists will capture a certain amount of these animals, tag them or mark them, and then release them. And then over a couple generations for those animals, they wait for them to reproduce, and then they might capture a few more, take a sample to see how many of them are there, and then, of course, how many of those have the marks and how many of them don't. So that ratio of marked to unmarked animals can kind of give a sense of how quickly the population is growing, because the unmarked ones, like the manatees here, the mama manatee is marked, but the baby is not. So the unmarked ones are going to be the new individuals. So they can learn how quickly the population is growing, the rate of reproduction, basically how the animals are doing. So population density is another important factor here, because if you're going to count, let's go back quickly to our clam. If you're going to try to get the geographical range and then estimate, count in a small area and then multiply that by the whole area and say, well, that's how many roughly there are, there's certain assumptions you're making. You're making an assumption that they're evenly distributed. What if you count in that little 1 square mile, and maybe that's an area where they tend to be more densely populated? So population density is kind of an important thing. This is the population density of humans. And as you can see, in some parts of the world, you find a lot of humans crammed into a relatively small space. So India, China, some parts of Europe have some of the highest population densities in the world. Other places, not so much. The Sahara Desert, the really, really cold northern climates, as you can see, northern part of Siberia, Russia, Greenland, Canada, and most of Australia as well, for being mostly desert. So population density is important. The number of individuals per area, or per unit area of volume. So now we look at dispersion. So again, if you make the assumption that animals are dispersed evenly, then it's easy to count them, but that's usually not the case. So there's basically three ways that organisms tend to disperse themselves. They can be clumped. So clumped might be an example here. Fish, they swim in schools. So some types of fish are clumped in their dispersion. They could be uniform, so they're pretty evenly dispersed among a certain area. Or it could be completely random, and their dispersal is not really uniform. It's not easy to count. So plants tend to be a good example of that, although naturally you're going to find plants near water. You're going to find plants near sources of things they need. But those are the three general ways that animals can be dispersed, and plants, not just animals, all organisms. So something else about populations is they tend to change in size due to environmental factors and lifespan factors. So this is important. We look at basically, here's two different species. Here's an example. Let's say they have equal survivability. So basically their ability to survive in their environment is the same. But one species has a generation time of 100 years. That means 100 years from mother to child generation. The other one has a generation time of 10 years. So which of them is likely to have a higher population at any given time? Again, assuming that they're equally able to survive in their environments. Naturally, you would think number two, right? So generation time of 10 years means that they're going to be having babies so much more frequently than the first one, that they're going to have a higher population. So that's just to show that the generation time is an important factor of estimating population. And scientists can also use what's called a survivorship curve. So it's used to display about how long an individual and population of a given age can be expected to live. And so we see three different types here. Type 1 is where you have a low mortality rate earlier to midlife, but higher with age. And an example here would be us. So humans would be a great example, and most mammals would fit into this category, where once you get past infancy, you'll survive pretty well. But then when you're older is when we start to see higher mortality. That's when people start to die more. You don't see the same rate of people dying off in their 20s as you do people in their 80s. Okay, so that's type 1, is the higher mortality rate is older. Type 2, constant mortality rate, so basically equally distributed. So the mortality of an older coral, in this case, is pretty much equal to that of a younger one. So their chances of surviving at any given age are about the same. Type 3 is kind of different. So type 3, high mortality rates early in life, but then a steady state once they mature. And really the best example here is plants. So if you think about this for plants, it makes sense. The chances of their seeds germinating and sprouting are not very good. They give off a lot of seeds, and most of those will not survive. And so the seed is basically the embryo. So that's basically the young baby plant. Most baby plants do not survive, and even if they germinate, they may not make it. They might get squished by something. They might get eaten by something. Their mortality rate's really high early in life, but then later when they're older, once they're big full-grown trees, their mortality rates tend to be much better. So they don't die off as quickly. So those are the three types. It basically has to do with when during the lifespan of an organism in a population will it die, or when does it have its highest mortality. And then we see there's other factors here too that can affect this. The clutch size, that means the number of offspring produced each time. The number of reproductive events, so like how many times does an individual reproduce in their lifetime. And then the age at first reproduction. So how young can they start reproducing? If they don't reproduce until they're pretty mature, then they're not going to be able to have as many reproductive events in their lifetime. So when we talk about fitness, you've probably heard survival of the fittest, but it tends to be kind of misused. Biological fitness really has to do exclusively with how well an organism can survive to reproduce and pass on their genes. So survival of the fittest is kind of wrong. It really should be reproduction of the fittest, because how long an organism survives really doesn't matter if it doesn't reproduce in terms of genetics, in terms of passing on genes. So that's something important for us to look at. Let's see. So I'm going to stop here for just a second and go ahead and start this up on the next video. So we'll take this in video 2.